This is what gaming looks like on a $1,000 GPU, and you'd think that the only way to get this type of performance is by dropping $1,000 bucks. But what if I told you this performance is actually coming from a graphics card I picked up for just $140.25? I know, it's crazy. But you might be wondering, how is this possible for a card that doesn't cost a kidney? After all, you can barely get an RTX 2060 for that price, and this type of performance at 4K is pretty much impossible even for $300. Well, that's because this was NVIDIA's fastest, most revolutionary graphics card that broke several world records, and of course, it's none other than the GTX 1080 Ti, arguably the greatest graphics card of all time. And despite holding that title, it's still underrated to this day. So underrated that I think this is the only GPU worth buying under $300. But is there really no better option in that huge price range? Unfortunately, the sad truth is that pretty much every graphics card advertised between $200 and $300 is either impossible to find at those prices or is simply not as good as the 1080 Ti. So in this video, I'm gonna prove that the 1080 Ti isn't just worth the money. It might actually be the only GPU you should buy for your gaming PC. Okay, I might be stretching it a little, but let me explain why I genuinely believe that this is the best GPU you can buy for under $300. First off, when it comes to NVIDIA cards under $200, there's only one real competitor, the Titan XP. With better specs across the board and an average price just $1 higher than the 1080 Ti, the Titan XP looks like the better choice. But these advantages don't translate to better gaming performance. The difference is usually just 1 to 5%, and based on what I can see, the Ti comes out on top in most titles. So for only $1 more on average, wouldn't the Titan XP still be worth picking up? Yeah, if you could actually find it at its average price. Unfortunately, when I searched for one, the only listing below its average price didn't include the cooler. The cheapest fully functional XP I was able to find was $240, which is a lot more expensive than the 1080 Ti that you can easily find below $179. And if you're patient, you can find one as cheap as mine at $140. But competition doesn't just come from NVIDIA. On the AMD side, cards like the 5700 XT, 6600 XT, and 7600 offer similar performance at equally competitive prices. Maybe not the 7600, but if you find a 5700 XT or 6600 XT at about the same price as a 1080 Ti though, they're still good picks. The numbers are close enough that it really just comes down to which one is cheaper in your country. But in my case, I went with this GPU for 3 reasons. 1, I found it for $140, and 2, I've had issues with 8GB of VRAM in the past. So with 11GB of VRAM, I can comfortably game at 1440p with higher settings. But you might have noticed that I only said 2 reasons, because the third and most important reason is that this GPU is not a regular 1080 Ti. This is a Gigabyte Extreme 1080 Ti.
We do not care.
And at first, you would think that it's disgusting and trash, but no, this is one of the fastest air-cooled 1080 Ti's to ever exist. However, without DLSS, frame gen, or ray tracing, this card would need to pack some serious raw performance to provide as much value as newer NVIDIA cards like the $250 RTX 3060 and the $300 RTX 4060. And let me tell you, we might need some stronger competition. Let's take Rise of the Tomb Raider as an example. You'd assume that a 2015 game would be a waste of time to test, but it's still very demanding 10 years later, to the point where the RTX 4060 is incapable of pulling 60 FPS at 4K ultra settings. The GTX 1080 Ti on the other hand doesn't really struggle at all with its 11GB of VRAM, making it perform nearly twice as well at 4K ultra, finishing the benchmark with an average of 63 FPS, something that the 4060 physically cannot do without DLSS performance. And just as a reminder, DLSS performance renders the game at 1080p and upscales to 4K using AI. Speaking of 1080p, this GPU continues to pull incredible numbers beyond 100 FPS in both 1080p and 1440p. Not that you need ultra settings because high settings look virtually exactly the same, but it's good to know that you have some wiggle room. Alright, but let's be honest, it's 2025. By now, we all know that the 1080 Ti, RTX 3060, and RTX 4060 all offer very similar performance apart from a few outliers. So instead of constantly comparing them to make the 1080 Ti sound better, let's see what this card can do by itself in 12 different games. And what better way to start than with a game that launched right after the GTX 10 series, Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Unveiled in the fall of 2018, this was one of the very first 11 games to support NVIDIA's newest RTX technology. The 1080 Ti shouldn't be capable of doing so because it doesn't have RT cores. So before we stress it out, let's see how it does in raw rasterization. Setting the game to 1440p highest settings sees an average of 87 FPS. Weirdly enough, we are actually seeing less VRAM usage than we did at 1080p in Rise of the Tomb Raider, which came out 3 years prior. And as expected, setting the game to highest settings with ultra ray tracing is going to turn our 87 average FPS into 37. Although if you really wanted to, you can still do decent ray tracing at 1080p. However, the 1080 Ti can't truly be the greatest GPU of all time without being able to run competitive multiplayer games. So before we finish up with the rest of the AAA games, let's quickly go through all of these esports titles. Despite Fortnite being mostly CPU intensive, a good GPU is still crucial for high frame rates. At 1080p, we averaged 330 FPS in Fortnite OG and 280 FPS in the standard Battle Royale mode. It does slightly bottleneck my Ryzen 5 7600X though. When paired with a better GPU, this CPU is capable of 360 FPS in Fortnite OG and 295 FPS in Battle Royale. The 10 series card also doesn't get as high of a max frame rate while looking into the sky, but again, this will get you more than enough performance if you limit yourself to 240 FPS. After a full game of Fortnite OG with a 240 FPS cap, we ended with a 1% low of 232, so the 1080 Ti can absolutely deliver smooth performance. And it's a very similar story with Counter-Strike 2. With the 1440p low preset, we averaged about 330 FPS. On a high, we maintained around 200, and when fully maxed out, we were still holding over 130. Next up is Marvel Rivals. Easily the most demanding of the multiplayer games in this video, it hovers around 60 FPS at 1440p high settings with FSR quality. With the medium preset, it only ever dips down to 58 FPS, making it a much more consistent experience. And with frame generation on top of that, it reaches up to 100 FPS without having too much input delay thanks to NVIDIA Reflex. Valorant, as the CPU intensive game that it is, can basically run on anything, so it wasn't much of a surprise that we got upwards of 400 FPS in combat and 600 FPS when nothing was happening. And just before we get back to the AAA games, we're going to be testing Rocket League. This is definitely a CPU bound game as well, but I do want to mention that because I have my FPS uncapped, my GPU is actually bottlenecking my CPU. This doesn't really matter because it's still over 800 FPS at 1080p, but I just wanted to point that out in case you're an alien with your 1000 Hz monitor. We gotta be inclusive over here. And at max settings, it holds a solid 450. At the higher 1440p resolution, it still maintains a solid 700 FPS. But me personally, as a pretty decent Rocket League player, I prefer to play on 1080p with quality rendering. So let's see how well it performs in a ranked 1v1. My way of judging a GPU is seeing if I can win on my first game playing with it. So if I lose, I'm never using it ever again. The input delay is a lot worse on unlimited, so if you actually play this game, please just don't play unlimited. It feels so bad. Regardless of the input delay, things were looking pretty good. Until they weren't. That is on target. Within the span of 6 seconds, I had already lost my 1-goal lead. But I wouldn't be a top 1% player if I didn't know that anything can happen. Under! Oh, got his ass! And for the last couple minutes of the game, it was just constant back and forth. This is gonna be a goal, yep. Not even gonna try for that. This gives me a lot of time to set up a big flick. Let's go! That's in my net. No way! No way! This video could not have been scripted any better. Hit that to the corner. Hit the corner. Hit the corner. No way. Come on. Oh. Oh no. Oh no. No way. What? I was just about to say this video couldn't have been scripted any worse. But he sold twice. I don't know why he went for that. He had no chance. No way!
Nice shot.
He sucks! Oh my god, you are the worst player to touch this game. The competitive games were almost too easy for the 1080 Ti, but now it's time to push this $140 graphics card to its limit with the rest of the AAA games on this list. Starting with Cyberpunk Phantom Liberty, probably one of my favorite looking games ever. With the 1440p high preset with FSR quality, we see an average of about 63 FPS. In Control, 1080p high settings was not even worth doing, so I instantly increased the resolution to 1440p, and though it wasn't doing great at high settings, after dropping a couple of them to medium, I was able to get pretty consistent 60 FPS. In some less demanding areas, it would get up to 100, so this game was also a nice experience. Next is the most VRAM heavy game in the entire video, Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, which I still think is very underrated. However, with over 10 gigabytes of VRAM usage, you would expect this to be at 4K max settings or something, but in reality, it's actually just 847p, not even 1080p, and this game is that that intensive on the GPU. And if for some reason you really don't like FSR, 1080p Ultra will keep you above 60 FPS most of the time. For the longest time, I've been wondering why Uncharted 4 is surprisingly demanding for a game from 2016, and then I remembered it was ported to PC in 2022. Regardless, the 1080 Ti handles it well, easily surpassing 100 FPS at 1080p Ultra and staying above 60 FPS at 1440p. However, in areas with dense grass, the frame rate drops to around 45 FPS, making combat quite hard. Dropping the settings to high doesn't quite cut it, but with FSR quality, the game becomes smooth again and looks about as good as native 1440p. And finally, for the most demanding game we're testing today, Black Myth Wukong. This game is no joke. At 1080p high, upscaled from 648p, it only averages 49 FPS due to the heavy foliage and lighting effects. The only way I could get a decent frame rate with high settings was using FSR at 50%, which means it's upscaling from 540p. So out of all the games tested today, I think this is the only one where I won't be able to play with my preferred settings, but honestly, that's fine. Black Myth isn't a game I play that often anyways. So is this GPU still worth picking up in 2025? Absolutely. I still think that this is easily the best GPU you can consistently find for around $150. But if you want to see me optimize a 24-year-old computer until it plays anything, watch this video next.